Alright, so we're back from our departure last time with the design discussion, and now we need to get into making our interaction system. Because we're going to need that to get doors to open, to get the doll to go do whatever the doll does, and all that good stuff. So let's get right into it. So here we are in Jira, and make a new epic called Interactions. You see it on the left there, and then make interaction receiver component the task in the backlog, and just pause and copy that description. But as you can see, we have quite a bit to do, so we'll get into that shortly. And as you can see, we have our interactions parent, and this is an engineering task. And yeah, doesn't it feel good to not be on the player character epic anymore? Alright, so now we're going to move this into the board, and we'll go over to our board, throw this into in progress, and I tend to like to filter out epics we're done with, and I forgot to mark player character is done, so you gotta make sure you do that. So click the little status and then done. Doesn't really matter, just good for your mental clarity, I guess. And we'll throw this filter on for just interactions, so we can stay focused on what we're doing. So now we find ourselves inside of Unreal, and in order to implement this system, we're going to have to go over a topic we haven't really covered yet called collisions. So to show you this, you don't have to do this part, but I'm going to open up our character, and we go in here and we click on our capsule component, and every collider in the game has what's called a collision preset. So as you can see, we have this marked as pawn, and it responds differently to the different channels and objects based on what we marked it as. So as you can see, it either blocks, ignores, or overlaps. And we have generate overlap events ticked up there, but no hit events. And that'll make more sense later. We're going to use these to have our interaction system work. But for now, just know that these profiles exist, and we're going to make one for our interaction system. So now that you know what they are, let's go make some. So they're in the project settings, so edit project settings, and make sure you check out this file because it auto saves, and if you do it incorrectly, then none of this will save. So as you can see right here, I forgot to press checkout file at the top right here. So none of this is actually going to save, but we're going to create a new trace channel, and please press checkout file or else none of it's going to save. I'll have to, as we make our interaction channel here, I'll have to check out the file later and redo this at some point. So be on the lookout for that as we make our interactable object and accept. But yeah, I'll fix it in a few episodes when I notice the issue, and that'll be when we're working on our interaction seeker component, because we won't really be able to tell until we implement that something's wrong with the collision. And here we want to set this to query only, because we only need to respond to hit events and overlap events. We don't need to respond to physical interaction. So as you can see, we're going to mark interaction as block and interactable object as block. And later on, I'm going to swap these to overlap. And I'll explain why then, but at this point, we're starting to get into some stuff that I'm not as familiar with. So just be patient with me if I make some mistakes now and again. Alright, so we'll close this down, and see I check out the file, but it's too late. At this point, the file won't have saved. And yeah, none of this is going to save. But it's all good, and that's all we're going to be doing with the collisions. And now we're going to move on to the second part of this video, which are interfaces. So that's another thing that we haven't really discussed yet. as we create a class in our CCS core, and we want this to be type none, and we're going to call this interactions, the folder that is, and the name is going to be interaction interface CCS. And I'll explain more what it actually is when we get into the code as we press create class, and then I'll skip ahead until I'm inside of Visual Studio. Alright, so here we are inside of Visual Studio, and I pasted in a whole bunch of code, but don't worry, we're going to go line by line. But what an interface is basically it is a way to talk to multiple different classes in a way that all of them will understand. So what we do with this interface is we attach it to other classes. And then once we do that, the other class will override the functions in the interface. And then everybody's kind of speaking the language at that point. And ignore the part in the description about casting, because we are actually going to use casting. It'll make things a lot simpler, and we will take a slight performance hit, but it's no big deal at this point. We'll go back and fix it if we need to, but I don't anticipate it being an issue. And then take note of after the description, we have an interface there, and that is the class for the interface. And notice there's just generated body in there, there's nothing going on inside of that. Where we declare our functions is inside of the class I interaction interface that we make just below that. So that's basically how this will work is we have the interface class and then the actual interface where we declare the functions. And this first function, note that all of them are going to be public. This is get is interactable. So eventually we're going to have a seeker component that is looking for interactable objects. And basically what this seeker component is going to do is it's going to be looking for something. The key we're going to use during testing is character. So it's going to say to every receiver component it can find, hey, are you interactable for the character key? And if the answer is no, it'll move on to the next object. And if the answer is yes, it'll interact with it and stop searching. Because basically, we're going to want the closest object to be interacted with. And you'll see more of that when we get into the seeker component. But for now, just implement this function as I do here. And next up, we have our receive interaction function. And notice that these are all virtual. And what that means is that we can override them in classes that implement this interface. And what this function is going to do is once we know that the object is interactable, it is going to then receive that interaction and then process it based on the key. So for example, certain things might have multiple keys that they can interact with, and then it's up to us as the developer to basically search for the key that's being passed and respond to them in the correct way based on whatever situation we find ourselves in. And speaking of that, the function below that, add interaction key, is where we are actually going to add interaction keys to the list that the receiver component is going to be using. So that's all that function is doing. It's adding the key. And then note that we're returning a Boolean every time here, just to notify the user that it was successfully added. And then we'll move on to the last two here. We have remove interaction key, and that one is pretty self-explanatory. We're going to remove the given key. And then we have update box extent. And what that's going to do is it's going to update the size of the receiver box component. So that's going to come up from time to time. And now we're going to go to the .cpp, and again, pasting in a lot of code. But what we're doing here is we're implementing all these functions. But as you can see, all we're doing in every single one is returning false. And what that's going to do is it's going to warn the caller of the function, hey, the component that this interface is attached to hasn't overridden this function. So that basically means that the caller knows the receiver isn't ready for the function they're calling, and they can do with that what they will. So when we start implementing that, we're going to add in little checks to check for that. But it's just kind of a little check to let us know that we forgot to implement the function. So then we'll scroll down here to the next bunch. And as you can see, it's the exact same thing. So nothing interesting here, just warning the caller that this hasn't been implemented on the class that is implementing this interface. And if you're a little lost right now, don't worry, because this is going to make a lot more sense when we start implementing the receiver component, which is what we're going to do in the next video. So with all that being said, thank you so much as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.